120, Serious Gaming and Simulations. Week 4, Digital Game-Based Learning Part 2, Video Clip 2 of 3. I'm Professor Bill Kapralos, and over the next few minutes we'll be examining the effectiveness of serious games and simulations. However, prior to doing so, here's the list of analysis questions for this particular video clip. Number 1. What is the real measure of learning? Number 2. Why is measuring learning such a difficult task? Number 3. What have previous studies of serious games and simulation effectiveness revealed? And finally, number 4. What were the findings of the study conducted by Plato Learning and Click Health? Are games effective? The measurement of true learning, whether it's in a serious game, a simulation, or in a traditional classroom type setting, is an extremely difficult task. The real measure of learning is behavior change, or in other words, would an individual, when faced with identical or similar problems in the future, do something different than before? But we can never know this until it actually happens. Hence, we have to resort to tests, where we provide a series of questions, problems, and hypotheticals that a learner demonstrate what they have learned. So far, preliminary studies indicate that learning games, when designed properly, do produce learning, and plenty of it while engaging players. Over the next few minutes, we'll take a look at some previous studies that have looked at the effectiveness of serious games and simulations in a learning context. A meta-analysis conducted by Kulik in 2002 of 6 studies that examined the use of simulation in the classroom discovered very limited learning effects, and no evident increase in 2 of the 6 studies that he examined. A review of articles related to assessment that appeared in the journal Simulation and Gaming in 2004 reports little evidence on the effectiveness of experiential learning, with insufficient evidence to conclude that simulation games result in meaningful learning. Hayes in 2005 conducted a review of the literature, 105 articles in particular, on instructional games, focusing on the empirical research on the instructional effectiveness of games, and determined that research on effectiveness of instructional games is fragmented, filled with ill-defined terms, and definitely contains methodological flaws. Furthermore, he discovered that players should have access to support to help them understand how to properly use the game. Hayes also determined that some games can provide effective learning for a variety of learners under different tasks. So in other words, you can't generalize on the effectiveness of one game in a particular learning context for one group of learners to all games in all learning areas for all learners. Furthermore, Hayes discovered that there was no evidence that showed games are the preferred instructional method in all situations. And finally, Hayes also concludes that games should include some debriefing and feedback to provide the learner with an understanding of what took place. Gosson and Washbush in 2004 conclude that there are 3 primary reasons why there has been little done to design studies and develop instruments that could competently assess teaching approaches. Number 1. Careful, rigorous research dedicated to developing a valid instrument and reflective of thought-out learning objectives is extremely time-consuming. Number 2. The criterion variable being used, which is learning from a computer-based simulation or experiential exercise, is elusive. We believe we know what it is, but what it looks like so it can be measured lacks form. And finally, number 3. Our present world does not appear to care enough for this work to be successful, and perhaps it should not. Despite the rather negative outlook on the effectiveness of serious games and simulations that these past studies have illustrated, many of them do date back several decades. Even in the past 10 years, there has been unprecedented development within the game development field, and it has been suggested that games more than 5 years old are quite old. And of course, one must also consider, and certainly not ignore, the fact that simulations in serious games may be a very effective means of safely and cost-effectively learning skills and attitudes which are hard to acquire by rote learning. Furthermore, there are many examples of studies that have demonstrated that learning games, serious games and simulations, when designed properly, do produce learning, and plenty of it, while engaging learners in the process. Livingston et al. In 1973 evaluated 7 years of research and over 150 studies to examine the effectiveness of gaming in an educational setting. They conclude that simulation games are able to teach factual information, although they are not more effective than other means of instruction. Furthermore, they discovered that students preferred games and simulations over other classroom activities, and that game simulations can lead to changes in their attitudes towards education, career, marriage, amongst others. A number of more recent studies have shown a very positive relationship between game-based learning and educational gain. For example, Plato Learning measured that a typical 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. elementary school day includes only about 3 hours of instruction when you account for lunch, recess breaks, etc. They developed PlayStation games for curriculum reinforcement in K-8 schools. And their motivation was that if they could get kids to play their games for 6 hours over the weekend, and the games were 50% educational, they would effectively add 1 day to their school week, and this would lead to higher test scores. They conducted studies with over 400 individual school districts and performed a meta-analysis. And they found that there was an increase in vocabulary and language arts of 24 and 25% respectively over the control groups that didn't receive the educational games. And they also observed an increase of 51 and 30% in math procedures and algorithm scores respectively, again, over control groups that didn't receive the educational games. Another example is from Click Health, who developed games for kids to self-manage their health issues, primarily diabetes. They conducted clinical trials that were funded by the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and found that in the case of diabetes, the kids that played their games, in contrast to a control group that played a pinball game, showed measurable gains in self-efficacy, communication with parents, and diabetes self-care. They also observed that urgent doctor visits dropped 77% in the treatment group. Finally, the effectiveness of virtual reality and games in the treatment of phobias and in distracting patients in the process of burn treatment or chemotherapy has been scientifically validated with the use of functional MRI. Here's the list of references for the studies referred to within this video clip. And this brings us to the end of this video clip and to our list of synthesis questions. Number 1. Aside from actual learning, are there other factors of a game that can be a good indicator of the game's effectiveness? Number 2, is it possible to test learning effectiveness implicitly, that is, without the player or the learner being aware of it? Number 3, despite the various studies that have shown little or no learning with serious games and simulations, can we draw conclusions that they are, as a whole, ineffective? And finally, number 4, is it valid to consider effectiveness by examining studies of previous serious games and simulations? This is the end of this video clip. Thank you.